is a hollow vessel, something less than human. A body without empathy, without remorse.
Bryan Kohberger, the suspect in the murder of 4 University of Idaho students, is revealing secrets that had never been known before.
Students: Ethan, Zana, Madison, and Kaylee.
And this time, not from the police or attorneys, but from a fellow inmate. Nearly a year after shocking the entire United States with a midnight massacre at an off-campus student house in Moscow, Idaho, the most silent killer in America is finally speaking out, not with words, but through his behavior. A fellow inmate who was housed near Kohberger for 6 weeks recently told the media that Kohberger never slept, obsessively washed his hands, showered for hours, and silently paced back and forth in his cell throughout the night like a ghost. This person said, "I was near him, and I swear to God he's not human." That strange behavior is just the tip of the iceberg, because at the same time, more than 300 pages of investigative records were unsealed, revealing the brutality of the case. The case seemed to have come to a close after Kohberger was sentenced to 4 life terms in early July. But what has emerged in the past few weeks shows we've only known part of the story, and the rest, dark, twisted, and calculated, is slowly coming to light. From a brilliant graduate student, he became a killer in the very field he once passionately studied. He understood how police trace suspects and once believed he could outdo every other murderer. But he was wrong. Coming up next, we will unravel the full course of the case, every layer of evidence, every psychological behavior, and the portrait of a murderer formerly trained in criminology. The incident occurred in the early hours of November 13, 2022. At a quiet 3-story house on King Road in the city of Moscow, Idaho. It was home to 6 University of Idaho students, a house frequently visited by friends, hosting small parties, and echoing with the laughter of college youth. But that night, no one heard any screams. No one made a desperate 911 call. There was only the silent, cold death, like the blade of the killer. 4 students, Kaylee Gonkovs, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were stabbed to death in their sleep. According to later forensic reports, the victims showed no signs of being tied up or restrained through physical force. They were attacked with a razor-sharp military-style knife capable of deep penetration and bone-breaking strikes, a weapon uncommon in impulsive murders. Kaylee Gonkovs, 21, was a senior majoring in technology. Beautiful, intelligent, and full of ambition. She had just accepted a job offer in Texas and had returned to Moscow to visit her best friend before leaving. She was sleeping alongside her longtime friend, Madison Mogan, 21, a gentle and sociable marketing student, beloved by everyone in their sorority. They were found lying next to each other on the 3rd-floor bed, stabbed multiple times with immense force. Wounds concentrated on the chest, neck, and face. Kaylee's body was so severely damaged that, according to the investigator's description, it was almost unrecognizable. On the 2nd floor, Zana Kernodle, 20, a lively, strong-willed housemate, had just returned from a party with her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, 20. Ethan, a freshman and one of triplets, was tall, friendly, and always seen with a smile. The couple was attacked in their bedroom. Zana was the only victim confirmed to be awake during the attack. Her body bore over 50 wounds, mostly defensive, indicating that she fought to her last breath. Ethan was found near the edge of the bed, with multiple stab wounds, believed to have tried to stop the attacker upon seeing Zana being assaulted. 2 other students in the house that night survived: Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. Dylan, who stayed on the 2nd floor, may have seen the suspect. She stated that she opened her door after hearing noises and saw a man dressed in black with bushy eyebrows wearing a mask, walking down the hallway and then exiting the house. In a state of shock and panic, Dylan did not call 911 immediately. She retreated into her room, locked the door, and went back to sleep. This later became a point of fierce debate in the media and on social networks. However, according to psychologists, such a response is entirely possible. It is a classic manifestation of the freeze response during extreme fear. The 911 call wasn't made until nearly 8 a.m., more than 7 hours after the massacre. Bethany Funk used Dylan's phone to call for help after friends who had come over discovered Zana and Ethan lying motionless, covered in blood. When police arrived, they had to immediately seal off the entire house. Blood had seeped through the walls and out onto the exterior, like a red trail slicing from the second floor down to the ground. Inside, the scene resembled a miniature battlefield. Kaylee and Madison's room had blood splattered on the ceiling, torn bedding, and knife marks embedded in the mattress. Zana's room was in disarray, signs of a violent struggle before she was subdued. One crucial detail: a Ka-Bar military knife sheath was left on the bed of Maddie and Kaylee. The knife itself was missing, but inside the sheath was a single DNA trace, belonging to an unidentified male at that time. This knife sheath became the key piece of evidence, launching one of the most complex and intense investigations in modern Idaho judicial history. There were no clear witnesses, no screams, no security cameras inside the house. The perpetrator moved like a ghost, and from that blood-soaked crime scene, police began to follow every fragile clue, every strand of hair, every corner of surveillance footage, every piece of cell phone location data, to track down the person who had planned the brutal killing of 4 students in the heart of a university town. The police initially relied on the knife, or more precisely the Ka-Bar knife sheath left at the scene, to begin an investigation that had virtually no witnesses, no surveillance footage, and no confession. The knife sheath was found on the 3rd-floor bed where the bodies of Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan lay side by side, soaked in blood. The black leather sheath embossed with the letters USMC, the insignia of the United States Marine Corps, was an accessory sold with a specific line of military knives produced by Ka-Bar. This knife is renowned for its sharpness and its ability to pierce through both bone and muscle, designed specifically for close combat. The wounds on the victims matched perfectly with the characteristics of this weapon: deep cuts, forceful stabs, clean blade paths. The victims were not bound, but there were signs of a sudden attack and desperate self-defense. Notably, the neck and chest were the primary areas of assault, indicating that the perpetrator was not someone inexperienced with a knife. But his overconfidence in leaving behind the sheath was his first mistake, and the only crucial piece of evidence in a house with no cameras and no clear footprints. The forensics team immediately examined the knife sheath. On the metal snap button inside, they discovered a trace of male DNA. Very small, but sufficient to sequence the genetic profile. When cross-checked against the National CODIS database, no matches were found, meaning the individual had no prior criminal record or previous arrests. However, instead of stopping there, the investigation team decided to pursue a bold approach. Using genealogy DNA, a method of tracing family lineage by comparing the unknown DNA sample to millions of publicly available genealogical records on platforms like GED Match and 23andMe. After several weeks, the system identified a person with the closest blood relation to the unknown sample: Michael Kohberger, residing in the state of Pennsylvania. Michael was a man in his 60s, living in rural Pennsylvania. A retired military veteran, he had no criminal record, had not left the state during the time of the crime, and had no known connection to Idaho. Police quickly ruled him out as a suspect. But his son, Bryan Christopher Kohberger, was a completely different story. When investigators expanded their search into the family background, they discovered that Bryan was currently living in Pullman, Washington, less than a 15-minute drive from the crime scene. And what made detectives shudder even more: Bryan wasn't just a local resident. He was a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. An ideal suspect in the eyes of law enforcement. Not because he was careless, but because he understood all too well how the investigative system works. Bryan's academic records revealed that he had conducted multiple studies on serial killers, organized criminal behavior, and the psychology of cold-blooded offenders. In one survey posted on Reddit just months before the massacre, Bryan shared a questionnaire titled, "I want to understand the emotions, thoughts, and actions of people who have committed violent crimes." In that moment, what did you think? How did you feel? Scholarly language, clinical phrasing, but full of implications. And now, when placed alongside the bloody crime scene on King Road, it became a mirror reflecting a distorted mind. Not only did Bryan study crime, he also exhibited numerous traits matching the witness description. Roughly 6 feet 1 inch tall, about 1.85 meters. Thin build, dark brown hair, bushy eyebrows.
He is a hollow vessel, something less than human. A body without empathy, without remorse.
All perfectly aligned with the testimony of Dylan Mortensen, the surviving roommate who reported seeing a man dressed in black wearing a mask with bushy eyebrows, silently walking down the hallway. He lived alone, was socially withdrawn, frequently visited the library late at night, spoke little, and showed signs of obsession with criminal behavioral structures in his academic writing. He had a habit of driving at night, regularly going out between 2 and 4 a.m., the exact time frame of the murders. And from that moment on, the investigation took a sharp turn. The killer was no longer an invisible ghost, but someone living among us. A man who could camouflage himself, who was intelligent, who understood the law, and that made him more dangerous than anyone else. In the first few hours after the massacre, investigators collected hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from intersections, convenience stores, gas stations, and residential cameras around the King Road area. At around 3:29 a.m. on November 13th, the estimated time of the crime, a white Hyundai Elantra with no front license plate was repeatedly seen circling the victim's neighborhood, driving back and forth multiple times as if scouting the target. A gas station camera a few blocks away captured the vehicle leaving the area at approximately 4:20 a.m., precisely matching the time frame police had determined for when the suspect fled the scene. Police compiled a list of all 22,000 white Hyundai Elantras registered in nearby states. After narrowing it down by geography, model year, and matching surveillance footage, only one car matched all the characteristics perfectly. It was registered to Bryan Kohberger in Pullman, Washington. And notably, after the crime, Bryan changed the license plates on his vehicle, then immediately drove across 4 states to his parents' home in Pennsylvania for winter break. A journey of over 3,800 kilometers, more than 2,300 miles. To police, this wasn't just a holiday visit. It was a strategic withdrawal. A classic sign of an organized offender aiming to flee the crime scene, erase traces, and wait for the situation to cool down. Not stopping at the car, investigators continued to trace Bryan's cell phone using data from Verizon. From August to November 2022, his Samsung Galaxy S9 had pinged cell towers near the King Road area more than 12 times, some during the day, but the majority after midnight. He had been watching that house, not once but many times, and he chose to strike only after being sure, knowing who lived there, who stayed on which floor when they slept and when they were absent. Even more suspicious, during the exact time frame of the murders between 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m. on November 13th, Bryan's phone emitted no signals. Police confirmed that the device had been manually turned off, an intentional act to avoid tracking. After that time, the phone was switched back on, and registered movement heading back toward Pullman, retracing the same route that the white Elantra had taken through surveillance cameras. Only someone who understood the surveillance system would know to turn off their phone before committing a crime. But ironically, that very action placed him under suspicion, because no one randomly turns off their phone for 2 hours in the middle of the night just a few miles from home. A signal blackout in the dead of night during the exact time frame of a massacre couldn't be a coincidence. It was a silent map the killer thought he had erased, but in reality, it was an unspoken confession. After identifying Bryan Kohberger as the prime suspect through genealogical DNA, surveillance footage, location data, and witness descriptions, police still couldn't make an arrest. The only thing missing was direct DNA evidence from Bryan himself, an essential element to convince the grand jury and avoid any legal disputes over inferred DNA from relatives. So in late December 2022, when Bryan returned to his parents' home in Pennsylvania for winter break, a covert surveillance operation was quietly launched by the FBI. The task force didn't follow him recklessly. They knew that Bryan had studied too much about investigative behavior, about how agencies track suspects. If he realized he was being followed, everything could fall apart. The FBI maintained remote surveillance, monitoring the daily routine of the Kohberger household. Every smallest detail was documented. The time trash was taken out, who entered or exited, vehicle usage habits. Then, an opportunity presented itself. On December 27th, Bryan or someone in the household brought a bag of trash to the bin on the curb, the exact location where police had the legal right to collect it. Inside, the forensic team discovered a series of potential pieces of evidence: used rubber gloves, toothpicks with saliva, and a paper coffee cup with a lip print. All items were immediately sealed and sent to the crime lab in Idaho. 2 days later, the results came back. Bryan's DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on the crowbar knife sheath at the crime scene. The match probability was 99.99998%. Immediately, an arrest warrant was signed. At 1:30 a.m. on December 30th, 2022, a Pennsylvania task force, in coordination with the FBI, surrounded the house in Chestnut Hill Township. Bryan was arrested in his bedroom. He did not resist, did not ask why, and showed no signs of panic. But when officers searched the room, they found something that sent chills down everyone's spine. He was wearing rubber gloves inside his own home. His laptop, phone, and hard drives had all been wiped. There were traces indicating he had used military-grade secure deletion software. His behavior was no different from that of a professional in erasing evidence, or someone who knew exactly how investigations work. It didn't stop there. Police also found a folding knife, a firearm, a black mask, rubber shoe covers, and most notably, dozens of books on criminal behavior, human anatomy, body structure, and serial killers. In his room were also documents related to unsolved cases, handwritten notes sketching out timelines and attack behavior charts. This was no longer academic research. It resembled a training manual or a silent confession. From a lone knife sheath left on Kaylee Goncalves' bed, a nearly 2-month-long investigation unraveled everything. Genetic trace, location history, surveillance footage, evidence of cleanup, direct DNA, items found in his home, and a flawless logical chain from victim to suspect. Bryan Kohberger, the man who once dissected the minds of criminals for a PhD, was now the very subject of the case file he once dreamed of writing. But what truly haunted people wasn't the evidence. It was his cold composure throughout the arrest. No panic, no argument, no tears, not even a question. In his mind, perhaps, it was still just an experiment. From the very beginning, the crime scene at 1122 King Road led police to believe that this was not a spontaneous act of murder. 4 students were stabbed while sleeping in 3 separate bedrooms on 2 different floors, with no signs of forced entry, no valuables stolen, no threatening message or note left behind. The method of execution indicated planning, ruthless, swift, and almost completely silent. To investigators, this was a clear hallmark of an organized killer, someone who didn't act out of sudden emotion but for a colder reason, an obsession with power and control. And as the name Bryan Kohberger gradually emerged during the investigation, the full psychological profile began to take shape. Kohberger was a PhD candidate in criminology at Washington State University, just a 15-minute drive from the crime scene. He had worked as a teaching assistant for courses on criminal behavior and had spent years studying serial murder cases. But unlike other students, what fascinated him wasn't justice. It was how killers escaped, how they manipulated crime scenes, how they mastered the game. Professors who had taught Bryan described him as intelligent but eccentric, known for asking disturbing questions such as, "If the killer has no motive, can the police still solve the case? Or if someone kills purely for psychological gratification, is that considered insanity?" It was within this distortion that criminal psychologists believe Kohberger's motive did not lie in the victims themselves, but within his own psyche. A person who had always felt isolated, on the fringe of society with a history of eating disorders, deep insecurity about his appearance, social anxiety, and, most notably, no intimate relationships with women. He had once told classmates that he couldn't feel the emotions of others, and that people often found him creepy without knowing why. So why did he choose the King Road house? The house sat on a secluded slope in the city of Moscow with no public security cameras, located at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by dense trees and only one entry point, a perfect setup for an unnoticed assault. 6 female students lived there, often held parties, invited boyfriends to stay overnight, and according to social media profiles, were all attractive, outgoing, and well-liked. They were the exact opposite of Kohberger's lonely, self-conscious world. When police retrieved cell phone data, they found that he had loitered near the King Road area at least 12 times in the 3 months leading up to the crime. Mostly at night, with no apparent reason and no specific destination. This was cold surveillance, a term used to describe killers who observed their victims from a distance, silently noting light patterns, door habits, schedules. On one occasion, his phone pinged just a few dozen meters from the house, close enough to hear laughter, see lights, and sense the daily rhythms of the girls he could never reach. Experts believe that for Kohberger, the massacre wasn't simply about killing. It was a performance of dominance, a silent declaration that he existed, that he could destroy those he resented. The beautiful, the beloved, the socially fulfilled. In his twisted mind, it was a moment of absolute control, where shame was washed away with blood and silence. However, that very confidence led to his downfall. Though he had meticulously planned to turn off his phone during the time of the murders, chosen a car with no front license plate, used gloves and a mask, he left behind a knife sheath with his DNA, returned to the scene too many times, and believed he was smart enough to never be caught. During the surveillance period, he even wiped his laptop, reset his phone every night, wore rubber gloves inside the house, and acted like a criminal out of a movie. But those very behaviors became the clearest evidence that he knew he was guilty. A man who spent his life studying criminals ultimately became the subject of study himself, and the one thing he wanted to control the most, the ending of the case, slipped completely beyond his grasp. After nearly 2 years of investigation, with more than 20,000 pieces of evidence collected, hundreds of witness statements, and a forensic logic chain built from a single knife sheath left on a bed, Bryan Kohberger was officially charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed burglary. The indictment stated clearly, the defendant's actions were not only organized and calculated, but also exhibited exceptional cruelty. intended to fulfill a distorted psychological need for power and control. At the preliminary hearing, Kohberger pled not guilty, chose to remain completely silent, and gave full authority to his public defense team. He offered no explanation, no motive, and showed no emotional reaction.
Is a hollow vessel, something less than human. A body without empathy, without remorse. He chose destruction. He chose evil. He feels nothing.
Not even when listening to the heartbreaking testimony of the victims' families. The four families, Goncalves, Mogan, Kernodle, and Chapin, attended each hearing, bringing photos, tears, and an unquenchable grief. The prosecution argued that Kohberger was a textbook, organized killer, someone who meticulously prepared, knew how to eliminate traces, and acted out of a pathological need for total control, not personal vendetta. He chose the house for its strategic location, the victims for their lifestyle, and carried out the murders as a kind of psychological ritual. They demanded the highest sentence: death by lethal injection. After months of legal proceedings, the trial officially concluded in July 2025. The jury took only 5 hours to reach a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder for all four victims. The court sentenced him to death, along with 4 additional life sentences without parole to ensure no legal loophole would delay execution. But what silenced the entire courtroom wasn't the sentence. It was the final moment when the judge granted the defendant the right to speak. Bryan Kohberger stood up, looked directly at the victims' families, and refused to say a single word. No apology, no tears, not even a sigh. Just a calculated, slight nod, as if he were the one closing the game. With the death sentence, Bryan Kohberger will be held in solitary confinement on death row at the Idaho State Prison, where each day is a countdown to an inevitable end. An ending for the man who once believed he was smart enough to kill without being caught. A man who studied criminal behavior and ultimately became the killer that every future criminology textbook will mention. Han Six Trong Tu. After being transferred to Latah County Jail, Bryan Kohberger showed no signs of mental collapse. On the contrary, he maintained a bizarrely obsessive routine, constantly washing his hands, showering for over 45 minutes at a time, and barely sleeping at night. Instead, he would pace around the solitary confinement corridor for hours, eyes vacant, saying nothing, showing no reaction. For the average person, this might indicate psychological breakdown, but for forensic psychiatrists, it is a textbook display of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, mixed with an intense need for absolute mental control. In a prison environment, where external control is stripped away, Kohberger clung to controlling himself, down to the smallest actions. He never spoke about the crime, never mentioned the victims, never uttered a word when asked about the case. But he would frequently ask others why they were being held in maximum security. That silence wasn't remorse, it was manipulation, a way to retain the last shred of power he still had. The power of withholding information, the power to leave others confused. One fellow inmate recalled that a simple joke on TV saying "you suck" caused Kohberger to explode in anger and yell, "Are you talking about me? Or my mother?" revealing a twisted ego, hypersensitive to honor and authority. Psychology refers to this as a vulnerable narcissism personality type, someone who craves validation but is also willing to destroy others when feeling slighted. In jail, he was not a defeated man. He was an observer of the entire system, as if he were still conducting a long-term study on himself. And that study, that framework of control, was the only thing he had left to hold on to. Bryan Kohberger didn't enter prison as a mere criminal, but as an undefined psychological entity, a living case file of an organized killer. Cold, clean, isolated, and dangerous. He felt no remorse. He was simply continuing to control within a room sealed by steel. The Bryan Kohberger case is not only a tragedy of 4 young students brutally murdered, but also a painful warning about killers hidden within the very education system, in lecture halls, libraries, and criminology classrooms. Kohberger wasn't a dropout. He wasn't a rebellious, easily identifiable outcast. He was a graduate student with a master's degree, had written a thesis on criminal psychology, and had even sent surveys to actual offenders to understand their emotions while committing murder. We often look for monsters through strange appearances or erratic behavior. But the most terrifying truth is this: Bryan looked no different from any other student. His intelligence, composure, and social adaptability made him more dangerous than anyone, because he knew exactly how to hide behind the facade of morality and knowledge. Behind the brutal acts of murder was an entire overlooked ecosystem, an academic environment that failed to detect personality disorders, a community that didn't question deep social isolation, and an education system that praised intellect but neglected mental health. How many more Bryan Kohbergers are silently watching us in libraries, in classrooms, or behind an essay on behavioral psychology? And how many more crimes will happen? Simply because we refuse to look into the dark side of those who appear harmless. When justice is served, the 4 lost lives cannot return. But the silence, both in Kohberger's psyche and within the education system, still echoes. And if we don't dare to break it, we'll forever live in the illusion that knowledge alone is enough to prevent evil.